She had nothing left to lose, and they made sure she knew it. A plus-size young woman standing alone at the edge of a dying ranch, holding a worn carpet bag and a single letter. No welcome, no warmth. Just a sharp-eyed woman at the door who looked her up and down and said, "We needed a cook, not a burden." Most people would have turned around. Abigail Harper didn't. What happened next on that frozen frontier would change every single life inside those broken walls, including the ones who never believed she could. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what I'm about to tell you is going to stay with you long after it ends. Iron Ridge Ranch, late autumn, 1887. The wagon hit the last rut in the road hard enough to rattle Abigail Harper's teeth together, and the driver, a leathery old man named Cobb, who had spoken exactly 11 words during the entire 4-hour journey, pulled the horses to a slow stop and pointed one gnarled finger toward a cluster of buildings disappearing into the gray afternoon. "Iron Ridge," he said. That was word number 12. Abigail climbed down without help, her boots sinking into mud that had frozen and thawed so many times it had given up deciding what it wanted to be. She pulled her carpet bag from the wagon bed and stood straight, shoulders back, chin level, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her mother away, before the years took everything else. She studied what lay ahead. The main house was large, or had been once. 2 stories of timber and stone that might have looked proud in another decade, but now sagged at the corners like a man who had carried too much weight for too long. One of the upper windows was patched with oilskin instead of glass. The front porch railing had a missing section that someone had never bothered to replace, leaving a gap like a broken smile. The barn beyond it listed slightly to the left, and the fencing along the near pasture had collapsed in 3 visible places, the posts tilting outward like they had simply decided lying down was easier than standing up. A dead garden ran along the south side of the house. Not resting, dead. Whatever had grown there had not been tended in months, and the frost had finished what neglect had started. This is the place, Abigail thought. This is what a last chance looks like. She had answered the advertisement in a Denver newspaper 6 weeks ago from a boarding house where she had been stretching her last $11 across meals thin enough to read through. The notice had been plain and unromantic. Cook and housekeeper needed. Iron Ridge Ranch, Wyoming Territory. Immediate employment. Inquire by letter. She had written back the same afternoon. The letter she received in return was signed by a Nathan Holloway, ranch owner, and it offered her a wage that was modest but honest, room and board, and exactly one sentence that she had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. "The position is yours if you want it, Miss Harper. I only ask that you be willing to work hard." She had been willing to work hard her entire life. Nobody had ever needed to ask. Cobb clucked at the horses and the wagon rolled away without ceremony, and Abigail stood alone in the mud with her carpet bag and watched the house for a moment, breathing in air that smelled of wood smoke and cold earth and something underneath both of those things. Something tired, something grieving, something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Then she walked toward the front door. She did not make it to the porch. The door opened before she reached the steps, and a woman appeared in the frame who seemed built from the same material as the Wyoming wind. Lean, angular, carrying a cold authority in her posture that announced itself before she said a single word. She was perhaps 50, with dark hair pulled back so severely it looked like it hurt, and eyes the color of flint that moved over Abigail with the slow, deliberate assessment of someone pricing livestock at auction. The silence lasted just long enough to be intentional. "You're the cook," the woman said. It was not a question. It was barely even an acknowledgement. It was more like a disappointment being confirmed aloud. "Abigail Harper." Abigail kept her voice even and extended her free hand. "I wrote to Mr. Holloway in September." The woman looked at the outstretched hand the way one might look at something unexpected on the bottom of a boot. Then she stepped back from the doorway. Not quite an invitation, but not quite a refusal either. "Margaret Voss," she said, "I am Nathan's sister-in-law. I manage this household." A pause that carried the weight of a much longer statement. "I will be candid with you, Miss Harper. I advised Nathan against hiring someone sight unseen. Now that I have seen you, I find my concerns have not diminished. There it was. Abigail had been waiting for it, or something like it, since she was old enough to understand that the world had opinions about what she looked like and what those looks supposedly meant about what she was capable of. She had been waiting for it in schoolrooms and at church socials, and in the offices of people who interviewed her for positions she was more qualified for than anyone sitting across the desk from her. The look, the pause, the careful wording that said, "We don't think you're enough," without technically saying anything at all. She met Margaret Voss's gaze without blinking. "I appreciate your candor, Mrs. Voss," she said pleasantly. "I imagine the kitchen is in some need of attention. Perhaps I could see it?" Something moved in the older woman's expression. Not warmth, nowhere near warmth, but perhaps a fraction of recalculation. She moved aside and let Abigail through the door. The kitchen was worse than she had imagined, and she had imagined it considerably worse than the advertisement had suggested. The iron stove was a good one, or would have been under different circumstances. Right now it was coated in a layer of grease and ash that spoke of months of inadequate cleaning, and one of the burner plates was cracked. The work table was scarred from years of use and piled at one end with the accumulated disorder of a household that had stopped caring about order. Shelves that should have held organized stores of flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, and preserved goods instead held an assortment of nearly empty tins, a broken clay pot, a mousetrap that had not been emptied, and a single jar of something that had been there long enough that Abigail could not determine what it had originally contained. She set her carpet bag down and opened every cupboard methodically, inventory taking in her head the way it always did. Not panicking, never panicking, just measuring the distance between what was and what could be. Half a sack of dried beans, a heel of salt pork, wrapped and forgotten at the back of the cold shelf. Dried herbs, most of them still useful if you knew what you were doing. A bushel of onions, partially sprouted. A crock of lard. Some cornmeal that had been improperly sealed and would need sifting for weevils. And bones. A bucket of soup bones near the back door, likely set aside for the dogs and never delivered. She pulled the bucket closer and examined what she had. "The previous cook left 6 weeks ago," Margaret said from the doorway, her tone carrying the implication that this too was somehow unsurprising. "We have been managing." Abigail straightened and looked around the kitchen once more. Not at the mess, but past it, at what the space could hold. The window faced east, which was good. There was a herb garden outside it, dead now, but the roots might still be viable if the frost hadn't gone too deep. The chimney drew well. She could tell by the sound of the wind through it. "I'll have supper ready by 6, she said. Margaret's expression made it clear she considered this an optimistic claim. She said nothing and withdrew. Abigail had her coat off and her sleeves rolled to the elbow before the sound of Margaret's footsteps had faded from the hallway. She built the fire first. The stove needed the crack in the burner plate worked around, not fixed, which meant redistributing heat in a specific way that she had learned from a cook in a Chicago boarding house who had worked with worse. And while the heat built, she began sorting and cleaning with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that the fastest way through a large problem was to stop seeing it as large and start seeing it as a series of small problems that could be solved one at a time. She scrubbed the work table. She cleared the shelves and wiped them down and organized what remained in a way that showed her at a glance what she had and what she lacked. She set the soup bones in the largest pot with cold water and the heel of salt pork and half of the onions, quartered, and she left it to come to a slow simmer while she turned her attention to the dried beans. She was sorting beans, fingers moving fast and automatic through the familiar motion of checking for stones and cracked skins, when she heard small footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside the kitchen door. She did not look up. She kept sorting beans and said, perfectly conversationally, "If you're hungry, supper won't be ready for a few hours yet, but if you want to come in, I wouldn't mind the company." A long pause. Then the door pushed open 3 inches and one gray eye appeared in the gap, at a height that suggested its owner was perhaps 8 years old and cautious about everything. "I'm not supposed to bother the cook," said a small voice. "Lucky for you," Abigail said, still not looking up from the beans. "I haven't started being the cook yet. Right now I'm just sorting. That doesn't count as bothering." Another pause. Then the door opened wider and a girl came through it, slight, with her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes, and an expression on her face that Abigail recognized immediately because she had worn something very like it herself at different points in her life. It was the expression of someone who had learned to expect disappointment and had decided that keeping a careful distance was the smartest way to avoid being hurt again. "I'm Lucy," the girl said. "Abigail." She nodded at a stool near the end of the work table. "You can sit there if you want." Lucy considered the stool for a moment as though it might be a trick. Then she came forward and sat on the edge of it, spine perfectly straight, hands in her lap, watching Abigail sort beans with the concentrated attention of someone studying for an examination. "What are you making?" she finally asked. "Bean soup to start. I'm going to see how the broth develops and go from there." Abigail glanced up briefly. "Do you like soup?" "Mama used to make soup." The words landed softly, without drama, but the weight behind them was enormous. Abigail absorbed them the same way she absorbed the cold of the kitchen, by keeping moving, by continuing to work, because stopping and making a moment of it was not always what a grieving person needed. "What kind?" she asked. Lucy blinked, surprised to be asked the follow-up. "Potato and leek with cream." "That's a good one." Abigail pushed the sorted beans aside and reached for the onions. "Tell me about your mama. What else did she make?" And there, in the ruins of an abandoned kitchen, over a fire that was just beginning to warm the cold air, Lucy Holloway talked about her mother for the first time since the funeral. Nathan Holloway came in from the north pasture at 4:30, leading a lame horse and wearing the expression of a man who had been fighting a losing battle for so long he had almost forgotten what winning felt like. He was 34, broad through the shoulders and weathered from years of outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes that had come from squinting into sun and wind rather than from smiling. He might have been handsome under easier circumstances. Under current ones, he looked like a man being slowly dismantled by time and trouble. He handed the horse off to his ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Tomas, who had stayed when 3 others had left because there was no money for wages, and came through the back door of the house pulling off his gloves. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Lucy was sitting on the stool near the work table, talking, using her hands, gesturing. And across the work table, a woman he had never met was listening with her full attention while simultaneously managing 3 things at once on the stove. The kitchen was warm. It smelled like something that had not happened in this room for a very long time. It smelled like supper being made. The woman looked up from the stove and met his eyes without nervousness. "Mr. Holloway," she wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt. "Abigail Harper. I arrived this afternoon. I hope this evening's meal suits. I've had to work with what's on hand, which is limited, but I think it'll be filling." Nathan looked at the stove, then at the clean work table, then at Lucy, who was still sitting there, still at ease in a room where she had barely set foot since her mother died. He stopped, cleared his throat. "Welcome to Iron Ridge, Miss Harper." "Thank you." She turned back to the stove. "Supper at 6? 6 is fine." He stood there another moment, not entirely certain why, and then became aware that he was staring and made himself move. "I'll get cleaned up." He was almost through the door when she spoke again, not turning from the stove, voice casual and practical. "Mr. Holloway, the East Garden, the herb beds. How deep did the frost go this year? The ground's still soft, about 6 inches down when I tested it. I'm wondering if the root systems are still viable." He turned back. "You want to revive the garden? In November?" "Not revive it entirely. Protect what's still alive underground. Get some cold, hardy things started that'll be ready when the ground thaws properly. Kale, maybe. Some root vegetables. It would help a great deal with what I can do in here through winter." Nathan looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time, not as the answer to an advertisement, but as a person who had arrived at a dying ranch and within hours was already making plans to make it less dying. "I'll have Tomas check the depth of the frost line tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded. "Appreciate it." He went to get cleaned up, and he was halfway up the stairs before he realized that Lucy had called something after him from the kitchen, something light and ordinary, some small comment about supper, and that it was the first time his daughter had called after him in months, that her voice had not contained the shadow of everything she had lost. Supper was soup and cornbread, modest and imperfect and completely honest, and the ranch hands, Tomas and the brothers Holt and Everett Crane, who slept in the bunkhouse, and had been subsisting on canned goods and burned flapjacks for 6 weeks. Ate in a silence that was not unfriendly, but reverent, the silence of men who had forgotten what it meant to be fed something made with actual care. Ben, who was 6 and conducted himself with the particular fearless energy of someone who had not yet learned caution from the world, had appeared at the kitchen doorway 15 minutes before supper, looking like he had run most of the way from wherever he had been, his dark hair disordered and his boots already muddy. "You're the cook lady," he announced. "That's one way to put it," Abigail agreed. "Lucy says you're nice." He said this like a report being filed, factual and direct. "She doesn't say that about people." "That's kind of her." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her with an intensity that 6-year-olds were uniquely capable of. "Can I watch you cook? You can help me set the table if you want." His expression shifted into something that was not quite suspicion and not quite enthusiasm, but contained elements of both. "What do I have to do?" she told him. He did it, carefully, with the effortful concentration of a child determined not to make a mistake. And when he had finished, he stood back and looked at the set table with an expression of private satisfaction that made something in Abigail's chest ache quietly. At the table, Holt Crane, the older of the 2 brothers, a taciturn man who had worked Iron Ridge for 11 years, ate half his soup before he said anything, and then he said, addressing no one in particular, "This is good." He said it the way a man might state a mathematical fact. Then he asked for a second bowl. Across the table, Tomas quietly did the same. Everett Crane ate 3 pieces of cornbread and looked like he might ask for a 4th, but thought better of it. Margaret Voss ate with the precision of someone ensuring they gave nothing away, but she ate everything in her bowl. And when she thought no one was watching, she ran the last piece of her cornbread through the remaining broth and ate that too. Nathan Holloway ate slowly, and once or twice he looked up from his bowl toward the kitchen door, through which could be heard the quiet, efficient sounds of someone tidying as they cooked. And his expression was not something that resolved itself easily into a word, though if pressed he might have said it felt something like the first breath after a very long time of not breathing quite enough. Ben ate with considerable enthusiasm and knocked over his water glass and apologized with great sincerity and then asked if there would be pie tomorrow. "There's no fruit for pie," Abigail said from the kitchen doorway, and before the small face could fall too dramatically, she added, "But if someone can find me some dried apples, I believe I remember a recipe that might interest you." Ben looked at his father. Nathan looked at Ben. Something passed between them, small, tentative, belonging to a category of things that had been absent from this house for a long time. "I think," Nathan said carefully, "there might be some dried apples in the cellar." Later, when the house was quiet and the fire had burned to coals and everyone had gone to their beds, Abigail sat at the kitchen work table with a stub of candle and the inventory list she had made that afternoon, and she worked through what she had against what she needed and what she could make of the gap between them. It was a wide gap. There was no pretending otherwise, but she had worked across wide gaps before. She had learned to cook in her mother's kitchen, where there was never enough of anything and everything had to count. She had learned to manage what she had rather than grieve what she lacked, because grieving what you lacked was a luxury that only people with enough could afford. She blew out the candle after a while and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. The creak of old timber, the moan of wind finding gaps in the walls, the distant sound of a horse shifting in the barn. A living house, even a struggling one, something still breathing inside these walls, however faintly. She had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter. The ranch was closer to ruin than she had expected, the debts heavier, the pantry barer, the grief in these walls deeper than any advertisement could have prepared her for. Margaret Voss's voice came back to her. "I find my concerns have not diminished." Abigail sat with that in the dark for a moment. Then she folded her inventory list, tucked it into her apron pocket, and thought about what she would make for breakfast. There was a child who had spent months barely speaking, and tonight had talked for 40 minutes straight about her mother's cooking. There was a 6-year-old boy who had set a table with the focus of someone performing surgery because someone had asked him to help and made it feel important. There were 4 men who had eaten a simple soup with the gratitude of people who had been a long time without care. And there was a rancher who had looked at his daughter talking in a warm kitchen and for one unguarded moment had looked like a man remembering what he was supposed to be fighting for. Concerns have not diminished. Maybe not, Abigail thought. But the soup was gone, every drop, and the cornbread after it. And the kitchen was clean, and the stove was banked, and the house was warm. And tomorrow she would get up before light and make something from the dried apples and the things she could salvage. And the day after that, she would find out about the herb garden, and she would make a plan for the cold frames, and she would start turning this place back into something that could sustain the people living inside it. She had come here with nothing, but she had done more with nothing before. She stood up from the table, straight-backed and certain, and went to bed. Outside, the Wyoming wind rolled down from the mountains and moved through the broken fencing and rattled the oilskin window and tested every weak point in the walls of Iron Ridge Ranch, the way it always did, the way it had done for years, the way it would keep doing, patient and remorseless, all winter long. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the kitchen chimney was still sending smoke into the cold sky. And inside, the embers in the iron stove held their heat carefully, banked against the darkness, waiting for morning. The dried apples were in the cellar, exactly where Nathan said they would be. 2 pounds of them, shriveled and dark and smelling faintly of the summer that had produced them. Abigail found them by lantern light at 5 in the morning, moving carefully between the shelves of the cold cellar while the rest of the house still slept, taking inventory of what was stored below the same way she had taken inventory of the kitchen the afternoon before. It was not much, but she had already learned that at Iron Ridge Ranch, not much was the starting point for everything, and the only question worth asking was what you intended to do with it. She soaked the apples in warm water while she built up the stove, and by the time the first gray light was showing at the east window, she had a pan of apple-filled cornmeal cake warming on the back of the stove, and a pot of oats going slow on the front burner with a handful of the dried apples stirred through, and the last of a small cone of brown sugar shaved over the top. Not a feast, but something warm, something that smelled the way mornings were supposed to smell, something that announced itself to the sleeping house and said, "There is a reason to get up today." Ben appeared first, as she had somehow known he would, still in his nightshirt, hair pointing in 4 directions, socks mismatched because he had dressed himself in the dark, and this apparently did not trouble him at all. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and breathed in with his whole small chest. "Is that apples?" he said. "It is." He was across the kitchen and up on the stool beside the work table before she had finished the sentence. "Can I have some now?" "When it's ready." "When is that?" "About 15 minutes." He appeared to be calculating whether 15 minutes was a survivable interval. He decided it was, barely, and settled in to watch her work with the same total concentration he had brought to table setting the night before. Abigail had noticed this about him already, that he committed fully to whatever he was looking at, holding nothing back. It was an exhausting way to be 6 years old, and also, she suspected, the reason he had survived the last difficult year as intact as he had. "My mama used to make oats," he said after a while. She kept stirring, kept her voice easy. "How'd she make them?" "With honey. We had bees." He paused. "We don't have bees anymore. Papa said it was too much with everything else." "That makes sense." She glanced at him. "Do you remember how the honey tasted?" He thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Sweet," he said, "but not like sugar. Honey tastes like it's from somewhere. Sugar just tastes like sugar." Abigail looked at him for a moment. "That's exactly right," she said. "You've got a good palate, Ben." He brightened considerably. "What's a palate?" She explained it to him while the oats finished, and he listened with his chin in his hands and the focused expression of someone filing information for later use. By the time Lucy came down, quietly and carefully the way she did everything, Ben had already been appointed official apple slice taster and was taking his responsibilities with enormous gravity. Lucy stopped in the doorway and looked at her brother and then at Abigail, and some small tension went out of her shoulders. Not all of it, nowhere near all of it, but enough to be visible. "You're up early," she said to Abigail. "Kitchen waits for no one." Abigail nodded toward a second stool. "Sit. Oats are almost done." Lucy sat, and without quite deciding to, she began telling Abigail about the bees. That was how Nathan found them when he came downstairs at 6. His 2 children at the work table in a warm kitchen, talking, eating, their voices carrying the tentative quality of people relearning something they had forgotten they knew how to do. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and Abigail put a bowl of oats in front of him without comment and let the kitchen be what it was, He ate standing up, looking out the window at the cold pasture, and he said, Tomas checked the frost line before first light. 6 inches, like you thought. Below that, it's still workable. Good. She was already thinking about the herb beds. I'll go look at it this morning. It's cold out. I'm aware. He glanced at her then, a quick sideways look that contained something that might have been reassessment, and went out to begin his day. Margaret Voss came down last, as though arriving after everyone else had settled allowed her to observe from a position of advantage. She took in the kitchen, clean, organized, warm, smelling of apples and oats, and the particular quality of a space being properly used. And she took in the children at the table, and she took her breakfast without a word, and ate it at the far end of the table with the posture of someone determined not to be influenced by whatever atmosphere was developing around her. But she finished her bowl. And when Ben, emboldened by the morning's general good feeling, offered her a piece of the apple cake, and she hesitated only briefly before taking it, Abigail kept her eyes on the stove and said nothing at all. Some things were better not remarked upon. The herb garden was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared, which was approximately the ratio she was learning to expect from Iron Ridge Ranch. The frost had killed everything above ground, lavender, thyme, the sage she could smell even in its dead state. But when she crouched and dug carefully with a stick near the roots of the thyme, she found the root system intact, fibrous and pale and alive, waiting under the frozen surface like a rumor of spring. The sage was the same. The lavender might come back if she protected it properly through the worst of winter, which would require cold frames, which would require someone to build them, which would require someone having the time and the lumber to spare. She made notes on the scrap of paper she kept folded in her apron pocket and moved on. There was a row of what had been leaks along the south wall, protected by the wall's warmth from the worst of the frost, and 3 of the plants were still viable. She left them in the ground and noted their location. Further along, almost invisible under a mat of dead weeds, she found a root cellar door built into the garden bed itself. Not the cellar under the house, but a small separate one, low and wooden, the kind used specifically for root vegetable storage. She pulled it open. The smell that came up was cold earth and something else, something sharp and sweet together. She lowered herself down the 3 steps inside and held her lantern up. Beets. A bushel of them, dried out along one side, but the core still firm and good. Some late turnips, 3 of them. And in the corner, wrapped in burlap and clearly forgotten, a crock sealed with wax that when she lifted and shook gently told her by sound and smell that it contained some kind of preserved fruit, plums, she thought, or damsons. Put up by someone who had known what they were doing, sealed well, probably from the summer before last. She sat with the crock in her hands in the cold little cellar and breathed out slowly. Found something good? She startled. She had not heard footsteps, and looked up to find Tomas crouched at the top of the stairs, watching her with curious dark eyes. He was perhaps 22, with a serious, careful face and hands roughened from years of outdoor work. Preserved plums, she said, and root vegetables that aren't past saving. She looked up at him. How long have these been here? Since before Senora Holloway was sick, he said. Maybe 2 years. Nobody thought to look. 2 years. Abigail looked at the crock and thought about the woman who had put it up, sealing fruit against the winter that was coming, not knowing she would not be there to open it. They're good, she said quietly. The seal held. She brought everything up, and Tomas helped her carry it back to the kitchen without being asked. That was the thing about Tomas. She was learning. He paid attention. He understood what needed doing, and he did it without requiring acknowledgement. He was the kind of person who kept things running in the background while everyone else was watching the foreground, and she had immediate instinctive respect for this quality, because she recognized it as her own. The cold frames, she said as they crossed the yard. Who does the carpentry here? Holt, mostly. Everett is stronger, but Holt is more careful. He shifted his grip on the beet bushel. What do you need? Frames for the herb garden. Simple enough. Lumber and old glass if there's any. I want to protect the root systems through winter and get some hardy seedlings started early. There's glass in the barn, old window panes, broken ones that got replaced and kept, because Mr. Holloway doesn't like wasting things. He paused. I will ask Holt. I'd appreciate that. They reached the kitchen door and Tomas set down his load, and looked at her with a directness that she found refreshing after the careful obliqueness of everyone else in the house. "Miss Harper," he said, "this ranch, it is in a bad situation. Worse than maybe you understand." She met his eyes. "Tell me what you mean by that." "The debt to the bank in Laramie. Mr. Holloway, he doesn't say how much, but I have worked here 4 years, and I know what a worried man looks like. He is more worried than last year, and last year was the worst year I have seen." He looked toward the barn, toward the listing wall and the broken fences. 3 men left because there was no wage. There is too much work for too few people, and winter is coming fast. Abigail set down the crock of plums and was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Do you know why you stayed?" she asked, when the others left. He looked at her steadily. "Because Senor Holloway is a good man," he said, "and because the children should not lose more than they have already lost." A pause. "And because I had nowhere else I wanted to be." She nodded. "Then we're working toward the same thing." He picked up his load again and went back toward the barn, and Abigail carried the plums inside and set them on the clean shelf she had designated for special stores, things to be used carefully, stretched across the longest possible distance. That afternoon she made beet soup with turnip and the salt pork she had trimmed thin and rendered slow for the fat, and she used the last of the onions and the thyme she had managed to strip and dry from the frozen garden, and the result was something darker and more complex than the bean soup from the night before. A meal that warmed from the inside out, the kind of thing a cold body needed after hours of working in cutting wind. When Holt Crane came in from the north pasture at dusk, ducking through the kitchen door to see if supper was close, he stopped and smelled the air and said with great economy of language, "Beets." "Beet soup," Abigail confirmed. He looked at the pot, then at her, then back at the pot. "Where'd you find beets?" "Garden cellar. Forgotten." "Huh." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Everett said you wanted to talk about cold frames." "Whenever you have time." "I've got time now, if you want to show me what you're thinking." She went out into the cold with him and showed him the herb beds and explained what she wanted. And he crouched and looked at the root systems she showed him and turned a clump of dormant thyme over in his hands with the careful attention of someone who spent a lot of time assessing things for structural integrity. "2 frames, south-facing," he said. "I can do that. Maybe 3 days if Everett helps me and the weather holds. I'd be grateful." He handed the thyme clump back to her and stood, looking at the dead garden with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Holloway planted most of this herself," he said finally. "Eleanor, I mean. She put in half these beds the year before she got sick." He was quiet a moment. "Seemed like a waste after, everything dying." "It didn't all die," Abigail said. He looked at her. "Below the frost line," she said. "The roots are still good." It was waiting. Holt Crane was a man of deep and long silences, and he stood in one of them now, looking at the garden that had belonged to a dead woman. Then he said, 3 days, and went back inside, and she heard him in the kitchen telling his brother to finish up in the barn because supper was ready. The plum preserve she opened on the 4th day, a Sunday, when the work had paused, and the house was quieter, and Ben had been asking about something sweet since approximately sunrise. She made a simple cake, careful with the flour, using it conservatively, stretching it with a little extra cornmeal, the way her mother had taught her, and she spooned the preserved plums over it warm, and the smell of them filled the kitchen and drifted into the dining room and then, apparently, up the stairs. She heard Margaret Voss stop in the upstairs hallway. She heard the pause, then footsteps coming down. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway and stood there with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had arrived at a position and intended to hold it. "Those are Eleanor's plums," she said. Abigail kept her hands moving. "Yes." "She put them up the summer before she died." Margaret's voice was controlled, but not entirely. "I didn't know they were still there." The seal held. Abigail set down the spoon and turned to face the older woman, giving her the full attention the moment required. "I can put them aside if you'd prefer. I didn't mean any disrespect." The silence stretched. Margaret's eyes moved to the warm cake on the table, to the dark jewel-colored plums spread over it, releasing a fragrance that belonged to another summer and another woman who had loved this kitchen and these people before Abigail had ever known they existed. "Eleanor would have wanted them eaten," Margaret said at last. The words came out careful, like something being handled that had sharp edges. Waste offended her considerably. That's a quality I have some respect for. Another silence. Then, startlingly, something shifted in Margaret's face, not quite softening, but the particular release of a held tension, the slow exhaling of a judgment that had been carried long enough to become heavy. She would have liked you, Margaret said, and then seemed surprised she had said it, and pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance. She was practical. She didn't put up with sentiment when there was work to do. A pause. She would have liked you. Abigail said nothing. She turned back to the cake and finished arranging it, and Margaret remained in the doorway a moment longer and then went to set the Sunday table without being asked, which she had not done before, and which she did now without comment, as though it had always been her intention. The Sunday supper was the best yet, not because the ingredients were better, but because the room had changed. There was something looser around the table, something that had unlocked. Holt and Everett talked more than usual, trading mild insults in the comfortable way of men who had worked alongside each other for years and had perhaps forgotten for a while that they were allowed to. Tomas told a story about a horse he had trained in New Mexico that had Ben gripping the table edge with excitement and Lucy leaning forward without knowing she was doing it. Nathan watched his children and did not try to hide that he was watching them, and once Ben said something that was genuinely funny, an accident, the best kind, and Nathan laughed, a real one, short and unprepared, and it changed his face entirely. He caught Abigail's eye across the table and looked briefly away, and she looked down at her plate, and neither of them said anything about it. After supper, after the children were in bed and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Margaret had retired upstairs, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger open in front of him and did not seem to be seeing the numbers he was looking at. Abigail was finishing the washing up. She had developed a habit of staying in the kitchen after the others left, because there was always something more to do, and because the kitchen was the only place in the house where she felt entirely herself. "I owe you an apology," Nathan said without preamble. She looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "The way Margaret spoke to you when you arrived." He was looking at the ledger but not reading it. "That wasn't right, and I should have said something at the time." "You hired me," Abigail said. "That said enough." "It wasn't—" He stopped, rubbed the side of his jaw. "You've done more for this place in 1 week than— I don't know how to calculate what you've done in 1 week." "I made soup," she said mildly, "and found some beets that were hiding." He looked up at that, and the corner of his mouth moved. "You made Lucy talk again. You made Ben feel useful. You made Holt volunteer to build something without being asked twice, which I am not sure has happened in the 11 years he has worked here." He paused. "I don't think that's soup, Miss Harper." Abigail set down the pot and dried her hands on the cloth at her belt and looked at him squarely. "Your ranch has good bones, Mr. Holloway," she said. "Good people. They needed someone to remind them that the bones were still good." She glanced at the ledger. "The finances are the harder problem." His expression changed, a door closing slightly. "The finances are my problem. I'm aware. I'm not asking to know the numbers. I'm saying that if there are ways I can help stretch what you have, in the kitchen, with the garden, with the stores, I want to know what we're working against so I can work against it properly." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the way Wyoming wind always eventually did, finding the weak points in the walls and testing them with patient persistence. "The banknote is due in March," he said at last. "If I can't pay down a significant portion of it, they'll start making other suggestions about what to do with the property." March. 4 months. Abigail looked at the kitchen, at the organized shelves, the clean stove, the banked fire, the small signs of a household being slowly, carefully rebuilt from what it had been reduced to. "What does the ranch produce?" she asked. "Currently. Honestly, cattle, but the herd's smaller than it was. I sold off stock 2 years ago when we needed the cash and haven't been able to rebuild numbers. Some horses. The garden. When it runs." He looked at the ledger again. "It's not nothing, but it's not what it was." She nodded slowly, working through it the same way she worked through the kitchen. Not panicking at the scale of the problem, just mapping it, measuring the distance between what was and what could be. "The preserved goods," she said. The things I've been putting up, the things that are already stored. If we're careful about what we sell versus what we keep, there's income there that isn't being realized. A kitchen that produces at capacity is a small economy of its own. She paused. And the herb garden, when it's properly running, there's a market in town for quality dried herbs, medicinal and culinary both. Small money, but accumulated small money adds up to medium money given enough time. Nathan was looking at her with an expression that was becoming familiar, the look of a man encountering something he had not anticipated. "You're running calculations," he said. "I grew up running calculations." She said it without bitterness, just fact. When you don't have much, you learn what it's worth. The fire crackled. The wind moved around the house. Somewhere above them, one of the children turned over in sleep, the old floorboards registering the small, living weight of it. Nathan closed the ledger. "Thank you," he said, "for the supper, for all of it. It's what I'm here for." He stood and took the ledger under his arm and went to the door, and then he stopped, with his back to her, looking at the dark hallway beyond. "Lucy was afraid to come into this kitchen," he said quietly, "after Eleanor died. For months she wouldn't come in here at all." A pause. "The first night you were here, I could hear her talking from the hallway. She was telling you about her mother. I stood out there for about 5 minutes and just listened." Another pause. Longer. "I didn't know she still had that much to say about her. I thought she'd gone quiet with all of it." He didn't say anything more. He went down the hallway toward his study, and Abigail stood alone in the warm kitchen and listened to his footsteps go, and thought about a girl going quiet and a kitchen going cold and a man standing in a hallway listening to his daughter remember. She turned back to the stove and checked the banked fire, the way she did every night before she went to bed. Then she took her candle and went upstairs to her small room under the eaves, where the wind was loudest and the window let in the cold most readily, and where she slept well because she was genuinely tired, and there was nothing about working hard that she feared. Outside, the cold frames were not built yet, but the lumber was already stacked near the herb garden, Holt having moved it there on his own initiative that afternoon. The beet soup was gone. The plum cake was gone. The kitchen shelf held its careful stores organized and protected, each item counted. The ranch was still in debt, the winter was still coming. The banknote in March was still waiting. But the chimney was still sending smoke into the night sky. And in the morning, Abigail would be up before first light, and there would be something warm on the stove, and the people in this house would eat it together. And that was not everything, but it was not nothing either. It was, in fact, a foundation. And foundations, as any good builder knew, were where everything began. The cold frames went up on a Wednesday, 3 days after Holt had stacked the lumber, and by Thursday morning, Abigail had transplanted the surviving thyme and sage into the protected beds and laid a layer of straw mulch over the more vulnerable root systems, and stood back and looked at what she had made from what had been written off as dead. It was not much to look at. 2 simple wooden frames with old glass laid over them at an angle to catch what weak winter sun came through the clouds, sitting in the corner of a frost-killed garden like the earliest, most tentative argument against giving up. But underneath that glass, in the cold but protected air, something was still growing. Something small and stubborn and unwilling to quit. The same way certain things were unwilling to quit, even when everything around them had decided they should. Ben had watched the whole construction from a safe distance, with the focused attention he brought to everything, and when it was finished, he walked up and pressed his nose against the glass and fogged it with his breath, and said, with great solemnity, "It looks like a little house." "It is a little house," Abigail said, "for plants that need protecting through the winter." He considered this. Do they know they're being protected? She crouched beside him, looking through the glass at the pale green thyme below. "I think they grow toward warmth without knowing why," she said. "They don't need to understand it. They just need it to be there." Ben was quiet for a moment, the way he occasionally went quiet when something landed in him differently than expected. Then he said, "Like us," and walked back toward the house before she could answer, which was just as well because she was not sure what she would have said. December arrived with the kind of cold that was not content to simply exist but had to make itself known, finding gaps in walls, turning mud to iron, rhyming the barn roof with frost that caught the low afternoon light and made the whole tilting structure look briefly, deceptively beautiful. The days shortened dramatically. the working hours compressing around the edges, and the household moved indoors and inward, the way households in cold country always eventually did, proximity and shared warmth becoming less a choice than a fact of survival. In the kitchen, this meant more time with Ben underfoot and Lucy appearing with increasing frequency to help. Genuinely help. Not the performance of helping, but the real thing, rolling up her sleeves and asking what needed doing next. She had a good instinct for it, Abigail noticed. She moved around the kitchen with a grace that came from having watched her mother work in this same space for years. Muscle memory encoded before the mind knew it was learning anything. "You've done this before," Abigail said one afternoon, watching Lucy pit preserved plums with a clean, efficient motion. "Mama showed me." Lucy kept her eyes on her work. "She said every woman should know how to feed people properly. She said it was one of the few things that never went out of usefulness." A pause. "I stopped after she died. I didn't want to be in here." "And now?" Lucy set down a finished plum and looked up. Her face was still careful, still holding that distance she kept between herself and the world, but something behind it had shifted in the past weeks. A slow, incremental thaw that moved at its own pace and could not be rushed. "Now it feels like she's here again," she said. "A little. When the kitchen smells right." She looked down at her hands. "Is that strange?" "No," Abigail said. "That's exactly what kitchens do. They hold things." Lucy nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been trying to articulate for a long time, and went back to her plums, and they worked in companionable quiet while the wind moved over the house, and the stove put out its steady warmth, and the afternoon light faded toward early winter dark. It was the following Monday when the stranger came. Abigail heard the horse before she saw anyone. A single rider, moving at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent, the sound of it carrying into the kitchen through the thin walls. She wiped her hands and looked out the east window and saw a man on a gray horse crossing the yard toward the house, and even at a distance there was something about the way he sat in the saddle, a particular kind of ease that came not from comfort, but from certainty. The ease of a man who had never been anywhere that he didn't believe was already his, that made her still her hands and pay attention. Nathan was in the barn with Tomas, working on the lame horse's leg, which had not been improving at the rate any of them wanted. Abigail heard the rider knock at the front door and heard Margaret, after a moment, open it. She went back to her bread dough and listened, the way she had always listened when she needed information that was not going to be offered directly. The voices in the front hallway were indistinct, but their tones were not. Margaret's voice carrying its usual controlled edge, the stranger's carrying a smooth, unhurried confidence that seemed designed to be pleasant while containing something harder underneath. Abigail was not sure she could have named what she heard in it from that distance, except that she had encountered similar sounds before, in the voices of people who wanted something and had the means to take it and were currently performing the preliminary courtesy of asking. She heard Nathan come in from the barn. The conversation moved to the front room where the words disappeared entirely behind the closed door. Ben, who had been sitting at the kitchen table practicing his letters on a scrap of paper, looked up. "Who's that?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Abigail said. "Should I go see?" "Stay here and practice your letters." He returned to his letters with visible reluctance. Lucy, at the work table hulling the last of the dried beans, did not look up, but her hands had slowed. The meeting in the front room lasted 40 minutes. Abigail knew because she was watching the clock on the kitchen shelf, an involuntary precision that she recognized in herself as the habit of someone who had learned that knowing the exact shape of a situation, including its duration, was useful. She put the bread in to bake and started on supper, the two tasks running in parallel the way kitchen work always did, and when the front room door finally opened and the sound of footsteps moved back toward the front door and then out, she kept working. Nathan came into the kitchen 5 minutes later. He looked the way a man looked when he had been sitting across from a problem he already knew existed but had hoped might somehow not arrive yet. And it had arrived dressed well and smelling of a city. He stood at the kitchen door for a moment. Ben looked up from his letters. Lucy set down the beans. "Papa?" Lucy said quietly. "I'm fine." He came to the table and sat down heavily, which was something she had not seen him do before. He was a man who moved with the compressed efficiency of someone who had too much to do to sit heavily anywhere. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Abigail set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He looked at it, then up at her. "Victor Ashcroft," he said, "land developer out of Cheyenne. He has interests in about 60,000 acres across 3 territories." A pause. "He wants to add Iron Ridge to them." Lucy made a small sound. Ben, reading the room with the unerring accuracy of a child who had learned to watch adult faces for information about the stability of his world, went very still. "He made an offer?" Abigail asked. "A generous one." Nathan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "More than the property is currently worth, by most reasonable measures." He said it flatly, without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with feeling. "What did you tell him?" "That I needed time to consider it." He looked up. "Which I don't, really. But I wasn't going to hand him an answer in my own front room while he was sitting there looking at me like he already knew what it was going to be." Abigail sat down across from him, which was something she had not done before at this table, had always remained standing, at the perimeter of the room where the help was supposed to be. She sat down, and Nathan looked at her, and neither of them commented on it. "Ben," Lucy said quietly, "come help me check on the herbs. It's cold outside." "We'll be quick." Ben went, complaining mildly, and Lucy ushered him out the back door, leaving the kitchen to Nathan and Abigail, and the bread baking in the oven, and the coffee cooling in the cup. "Tell me what you're thinking," Abigail said. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind hit the side of the house with a sound like a flat palm on timber. "I'm thinking that the numbers don't lie," he said. "The banknote in March. The herd that's half what it should be, 3 men short on labor, 1 lame horse, and another that's aging out. The debt on the lumber we used to repair the north barn wall last spring." He listed these things in the same tone a doctor might list symptoms. Clinical, precise, the voice of someone who had examined the situation closely and was not flinching from what he saw. "On paper, Abigail, on paper this ranch does not survive to spring." She noted, without making anything of it, that he had used her name, not Miss Harper, the way he always spoke to her in front of the others, but Abigail, unguarded and direct. "What does it feel like off paper?" she asked. He looked at her sharply. "Because paper doesn't include the cold frames," she said. "Or the herb garden coming back. Or Holt and Everett working like they mean it again, which is different from the way Tomas described them working 6 weeks ago. Or the preserved stores that are going to carry this household well into spring at current consumption rates. Or," she paused, "or the fact that your children are eating full meals and sleeping through the night and beginning to remember what it feels like to live in a house that's worth living in." Nathan stared at her. "I'm not saying the numbers are wrong," she continued, her voice steady and practical, the voice she used when she was working through a kitchen problem that had more constraints than resources. "I'm saying the numbers are incomplete. They don't include everything that's changed in the past 6 weeks, and the changes are real, and they have value even if the ledger hasn't caught up to them yet." The silence stretched between them long enough that the fire spoke into it, a small shift in settle of coals. "He'll come back," Nathan said finally. "Ashcroft. He said he'd give me 2 weeks to think it over, but the way he said it made it clear he expects the answer to be yes. Men like him always expect the answer to be yes. They're accustomed to it." "What happens to the ranch if you sell?" "He'll run cattle on it, large-scale operation. He has the capital to do it properly where I don't." Nathan looked at his hands. The hands would likely keep their jobs, at least for a while. He'd need the local knowledge. "And the house?" A pause. He mentioned converting the main house to an operational headquarters, office, storage. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Abigail looked at the kitchen, at the clean shelves, the organized stores, the herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beam she had strung a cord across in her second week. She looked at the work table where Lucy had been hulling beans 20 minutes ago, and at the stool where Ben sat every morning eating his oats and telling her everything that had passed through his mind since waking. She looked at the stove that she had learned every particular quirk of, the way a musician learned an instrument, the hot spot at the back left, the draft that made the right front burner run cold, the particular sound it made when the firebox needed loading. "You're not going to sell," she said. It was not a question. Nathan looked at her. "I don't know that," he said. "Yes, you do." She said it quietly, but without softness. The way you said a true thing to someone who needed to hear it rather than be protected from it. You used the word feel. You asked what it felt like off paper. A man who was going to sell wouldn't ask that. Another long silence. Nathan looked out the window at the yard, at the cold gray afternoon, at the barn with its listing wall, and the pasture beyond it, where 3 men were insufficient to do the work that needed doing. It's not just about me, he said. If I hold on and the bank forecloses in March, the children lose this place anyway, and there's nothing. At least if I sell, there's something left to take somewhere else. And if you don't sell, and you make it to March, then I have to make April and May and June. And if you make those too? He looked at her. Then I have to make next year, he said, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Not quite hope, too fragile yet to be called that, but the preliminary motion toward it. The way a muscle moves before the body decides to stand. Abigail stood up from the table and went to check the bread. She turned the pan, checked the color of the crust, replaced it. Behind her, she could hear Nathan picking up his coffee cup. There's something else, she said, with her back to him. Ashcroft. When he was talking to Margaret before you came in, could you hear anything of it? Some. What tone did he use with her? A pause. Complimentary, Nathan said slowly, almost familiar, like he'd met her before. Abigail turned from the oven. Had he? Nathan's expression shifted through several things. Not that I know of. He set down the cup. Why? Men like that, she said carefully, don't generally spend time being warm with a housekeeper unless the housekeeper serves some purpose. Who in this house would he want on his side before he made his offer? Nathan was very still for a moment. Then he stood, and his face had settled into something focused and unreadable. I'll talk to Margaret, he said. He left the kitchen, and Abigail heard his footsteps go toward the back of the house, and then up the stairs, measured and deliberate. She turned back to the stove and stood with her hands braced on the edge of it, looking at the flames through the grate, thinking through what she had not yet said to him, the parts of it that were not her place to say, the calculations she was running that went beyond the kitchen and the garden and the stores. She had been doing sums in her head since the moment she had heard that horse cross the yard. Not money sums, though those too, but other kinds. The sum of a family that had been coming back to itself by degrees, measurable now in the way Holt lingered at the supper table longer than he needed to, in the way Margaret had started checking the bread without being asked, in the way Nathan had sat down heavily at the kitchen table and not tried to carry it alone. The sum of 6 weeks of work that had begun to add up to something she did not have a word for, but recognized the shape of. The conversation between Nathan and Margaret lasted 20 minutes, and when Nathan came back downstairs, his face was controlled but his eyes were hard. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He approached Margaret 2 weeks ago, he said, in town, at the dry goods store. He knew who she was. He told her the ranch was in unsalvageable difficulty and that the kindest thing she could do for her late sister's children was to encourage Nathan to accept a fair price before the bank made the decision for him. He stopped. He told her he had spoken to the bank in Laramie, that they were prepared to move on the note in January rather than March if Nathan showed signs of irrationality was the word Margaret said he used. Abigail absorbed this. He's been working the approach from multiple angles, she said. That's one way to put it. Nathan's jaw was set. Margaret thought she was looking out for the children. She didn't understand she was being managed. Does she understand now? I believe so. He was quiet a moment. She's upset. With herself more than with him, I think. Abigail thought of Margaret eating Eleanor's plum cake. Margaret setting the Sunday table without being asked. Margaret's face, carefully composed when she had said she would have liked you, and the price that admission had cost her. She loves this family, Abigail said. I know that. Then don't let her carry this alone. She met his eyes across the kitchen. She made a mistake. She made it because she was frightened and someone told her a story she wanted to believe because it seemed safer than the truth. That's not wickedness, Mr. Holloway. That's just grief in a practical woman's clothing. Something moved through Nathan's face. He looked at her for a long, still moment, and in that moment she was aware, in the way she was sometimes aware of things she would rather not be, complications that had no useful place in her current situation, that he was not looking at her the way an employer looked at an employee, had not been, perhaps, for some time. She looked away first. "Supper in an hour," she said. He stayed in the doorway another moment. Then, "Yes, right." He straightened. "I'll tell Ashcroft no when he comes back." "I know. It might be foolish." "It might be," she agreed, "or it might be exactly the thing that gets this ranch to April." She began slicing bread for the table. "Which amounts to the same thing, Mr. Holloway. The only way to find out is to not sell." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Short, reluctant, the kind that came from someone who was not ready to be amused by their own situation, but was being moved there against their will. He went to find his children. Abigail set the bread on the table and went back to the stove, and stood there with the familiar warmth of the fire against her face, and thought about Victor Ashcroft on his gray horse, moving with the ease of a man who had never been anywhere he believed was not already his. She thought about what it took to tell a man like that no. Not money, not certainty, not even courage, exactly, though courage was part of it. What it took, she thought, was the conviction that what you were protecting was worth more than what you were being offered. And that conviction did not come from a ledger. It came from 6 weeks of bread and soup and cold frames, and a girl who had started talking again, and a boy who had learned the word pallet, and a rancher who stood in hallways listening to his daughter remember her mother. It came from kitchens that held things. The bread was warm on the table when they all came in from the cold, one by one, shaking the frost from their coats, and taking their places around the table with the particular ease of people who had recently remembered that this was where they belonged. Ben took his chair and knocked into the table, getting into it, and apologized and knocked his spoon off, retrieving his napkin, and apologized for that too, and Lucy shook her head at him with the precise, fond exasperation of an older sister. And Margaret came last and sat down and unfolded her napkin and looked at the table and then at Abigail, and something passed between them that was not an apology and not a forgiveness, but existed in the space between those two things, the complex and adequate place where most real understanding actually lives. Nathan looked at his family around the table. He picked up his spoon. "Pass the bread," he said, and they did. Ashcroft came back on a Friday, 12 days after his first visit, riding the same gray horse with the same unhurried certainty. And this time he brought a second man with him, a thin, pale-faced individual carrying a leather satchel who had the particular look of someone whose primary occupation involved paper and numbers and the legal weight of both. Abigail saw them cross the yard from the kitchen window. She dried her hands and went to find Nathan. He was already at the front door. She did not know if he had been watching for them or if he simply heard the horses the way a man heard things on his own land. As signals, information, the constant ambient language of a place he knew better than anywhere else. He was standing in the front hallway with his coat still on from the morning's work, and when Abigail came to the hallway door, he glanced at her once, just once, and something passed between them that had no words but did not need any. He opened the door before Ashcroft knocked. Victor Ashcroft was a handsome man in his late 40s, the kind of handsome that had been maintained rather than simply possessed. Expensive clothes worn with the ease of long habit, dark hair silvering at the temples in a way that suggested authority rather than age. He had a smile that arrived before the rest of his face caught up to it, which was the specific variety of smile that Abigail had learned over the years to read as a tool rather than an expression. "Nathan." He stepped forward with his hand extended, using the first name with the comfortable familiarity of someone establishing a dynamic rather than acknowledging an existing one. "I appreciate you seeing me. I know you're a busy man." "Mr. Ashcroft." Nathan shook the hand briefly and stepped back. "Come in." They went into the front room. Nathan did not ask Abigail to bring anything, and she did not offer. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and kept her hands moving and listened to what could be heard and thought about what could not. Lucy appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, her face carefully neutral in the way she had learned from Margaret, carrying something beneath the neutrality that Abigail recognized as controlled fear. "Who is he?" she asked. "A businessman from Cheyenne." Abigail kept her voice even. "He wants to buy the ranch." Lucy went very still, then with a precision that reminded Abigail painfully of Nathan in his more composed moments. "Is Papa going to sell?" "No." Abigail said it without hesitation, and Lucy looked at her and something in the girl's posture shifted, not relief exactly, because she was old enough to understand that things people said they would not do sometimes turned out to be things they did. But something close to it, something that allowed her to breathe. "How do you know?" Lucy asked. "Because he's already decided." She looked at Lucy squarely. "Your father knows what this ranch is worth. Not the money worth. The other kind." Lucy stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, her gray eyes moving over Abigail's face with that searching quality she had, the habit of looking at things the way you looked at ice you were not sure would hold your weight. "You care about this place," she said finally. It was neither a question nor an accusation, but something in between, an observation being tested against the evidence available. "Yes," Abigail said simply. "Why? You only just got here." Abigail thought about this honestly because Lucy was the kind of person who deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "Some places feel like they've been waiting for you," she said. "I don't know how to explain it better than that. I walked up to this house the first day, and it was half broken and cold, and your aunt was looking at me like I was a problem she hadn't ordered, and I still felt it." She paused. "Some things you can't talk yourself out of just because they're inconvenient." Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then she came into the kitchen and picked up the paring knife and the turnips Abigail had set aside for supper and began peeling without being asked, the same way her mother must have done in this same kitchen on ordinary afternoons, reaching for the work the way people reached for the familiar when the uncertain became too large. They worked side by side in silence, and the silence was not empty but full of things that did not require saying. The meeting in the front room lasted an hour and 10 minutes this time. When Nathan came back to the kitchen, his face was composed and his eyes were clear, and the set of his shoulders held something that had not been there before. Something recovered, or perhaps something newly decided, which was not always the same thing, but sometimes felt it. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "I told him no," he said. Lucy looked up from her turnips. Abigail looked up from the stove. "He increased the offer," Nathan continued, "substantially. His associate had papers drawn up already." A short pause. "He seemed genuinely surprised when I declined." "Men like that usually are," Abigail said. He didn't take it badly exactly. He was very smooth about it." Nathan's expression moved through something. "He said the offer would remain open until the end of February, that he understood I might reconsider as winter deepened and the realities of the situation became more pressing. He said this in a tone that made clear what he thought of the careful condescension packed into that phrasing. "He's leaving a door open," Abigail said. "He is. He's confident." Nathan looked at her. "He has reason to be, objectively speaking. The situation hasn't changed. The banknote is still in March. We're still short on labor and long on problems." "But you said no." "I said no." Lucy set down the paring knife and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her father, which was not something Abigail had seen her do before. She was a girl who kept her affection at a careful distance, rationing it in the way someone rationed anything they were afraid of losing. Nathan brought one arm around her and held her there, and his face over her head did something that Abigail looked away from because it was not hers to witness. She went back to the stove and paid close attention to the turnips. That night after supper, Nathan spread the ledger on the kitchen table again, and this time he did not sit alone with it. Tomas pulled up a chair. Holt Crane came in from the bunkhouse on some pretext about the morning schedule and then did not leave. Everett drifted in after his brother. Margaret sat at the far end of the table and said nothing but did not go upstairs. Abigail worked at the counter and listened and contributed when she had something specific to contribute, which was more often than Nathan seemed to expect. "The preserve stores through January," she said at one point. "I can stretch what we have through February if we're careful. That reduces cash outlay on food, which can go toward the note." "The dried herb lot we sent to Harmon's store in town," Tomas added. "He wrote last week that he could take more. Medicinal, especially. There's a doctor in Casper who has been buying through Harmon." Nathan looked up from the ledger. "How much more?" "Twice what we sent. Maybe 3 times, if the spring planting goes well." "That's spring money." "It's spring money that becomes March money if Harmon will advance against the order," Abigail said. "It's a conversation worth having." Nathan wrote something in the margin of the ledger. Holt Crane, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his face doing its usual impersonation of a cliff face, cleared his throat. "The breeding stock," he said. "That roan mare and the 2 quarter horses. Ashcroft's man was looking at them when they came in. Whatever that's worth to you." Nathan looked at him. I'm saying, Holt continued, that there might be buyers for good breeding stock who aren't named Ashcroft. If we need to convert something to cash before March without selling off cattle at winter prices. The table went quiet. This was the most Holt Crane had said in a single contribution in anyone's memory, and he seemed mildly alarmed by it himself, retreating into his coffee cup immediately after. That's worth looking into, Nathan said carefully. Everett nodded. Margaret, at the end of the table, had her hands folded around her own cup and was looking at the ledger with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they did not particularly like, but were doing honestly. My sister left me a small bequest, she said, quietly, without drama, like a fact being placed on the table alongside the other facts. Not large, but it has been sitting in a bank in Laramie for 2 years because I could not determine what Eleanor would have wanted it used for. She paused. I believe she would have wanted it used for this. The silence that followed was of a particular quality, the quality of a room full of people understanding that something significant had just been offered, and that the only adequate response was to receive it with the seriousness it deserved. Nathan looked at his sister-in-law for a long moment. Margaret, I am not asking you to discuss it, she said in her most precise voice. I am informing you that it is available. What you do with that information is your affair. She stood, wished everyone a composed good night, and went upstairs. In the silence she left behind, Everett Crane said very quietly, Huh. It was under the circumstances an entirely sufficient observation. The cold deepened through the third week of December with a seriousness that the earlier frosts had only hinted at. The temperature dropped below 0 on a Tuesday night and stayed there, and the wind that came down from the mountains had the quality of something that had made a decision and was not interested in counter-arguments. The horses had to be brought into the barn. The cattle in the north pasture needed breaking through to water twice daily, the ice reforming faster than it could be cleared, and Nathan and Tomas and the Crane brothers worked in shifts through the worst of it, coming in with faces gone numb and hands that took 10 minutes beside the stove to remember their function. Abigail kept the stove going around the clock. She had not planned to do this, had not been asked to do this, but the first time she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of wind hitting the house like something with intention, and went down to find the kitchen temperature had dropped enough to threaten the bread she had set to rise, she simply stayed up and kept the fire built and made coffee. And when Tomas came in from the first water breaking at 3 a.m, he found a warm kitchen and a cup waiting for him, and did not comment on it, but wrapped both hands around the cup and stood at the stove with his eyes closed for a long moment. You did not have to stay up, he said. The bread would have died, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had dealt with enough hard winters to know that bread was not the only reason a person stayed up feeding a fire. But he did not say this either, and she was grateful for that. Nathan came in at 4:30, after the second water breaking, moving carefully the way cold, stiffened bodies moved, and stopped when he found the kitchen lit and warm. He looked at the stove and at the coffee and at Abigail, who was sitting at the work table with a mending basket and a candle, because there was always mending, and the middle of the night was a reasonable time to work through it. You've been here all night, he said. The fire needed watching. He pulled off his outer coat with hands that were not yet fully cooperative and hung it near the stove. She poured coffee and put it where he could reach it. He sat down across from her at the work table, the natural, unthinking way someone sat down in a kitchen they had decided was safe, and wrapped his hands around the cup. It's -12 out there, he said. I thought it might be. The cattle in the north pasture are holding. The water's staying open as long as we keep at it. He stared at the coffee. Tomas hasn't complained once. Holt and Everett haven't either. A pause. I keep waiting for one of them to say it's not worth the wage, which it isn't currently, and leave. They're not going to leave, Abigail said. How can you be sure? She set down the mending. Because they stopped working here about 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. They stopped being employees and started being something else, she said. I don't know what the right word is. Invested, maybe. They're not staying for the wage anymore, Nathan. They're staying because they want to see how this comes out. He absorbed this in silence, turning the coffee cup slowly in his hands. You do that, he said. To people. I don't think you know you're doing it. She looked at him. Do what? Make them feel like the outcome matters. He met her eyes. Like what happens here is worth caring about. People were running out the door before you arrived, And you've been here 8 weeks and no one's left, and 3 of them are waking up at 2 in the morning to break ice in -12 temperatures, and none of them are complaining." He paused. "That's not soup, Abigail. I said it before, but I mean it differently now. That's something else entirely." The fire spoke into the silence. The wind moved around the house in its patient, remorseless way. "I grew up in a place where nobody stayed," she said, after a moment, not looking at him, looking at the mending in her hands. "My father left before I was old enough to remember him. My mother worked herself to death, keeping us in a single room above a laundry in Cincinnati. After she died, I had 3 different situations in 4 years. None of them wrong, exactly, but none of them. I never felt anywhere that I was meant to be there." She paused. "I've been moving since I was 19. Every time I thought I might stop, something made the decision for me." She looked up. "I'm 26 years old, and the kitchen of a half-broken ranch in Wyoming is the first place I've felt in the right location since my mother was alive. So it's not that I'm doing something to other people, it's that this place does something to me. I think maybe it just shows." Nathan was looking at her with an expression she had no name for and was not certain she should try to name. "Your mother," he said quietly. "How long ago?" 6 years. "What was she like?" Abigail smiled, the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. "Relentless," she said. "Practical to the bone. Terrible at accepting help and spectacular at giving it. She could make a meal out of nothing and make it taste like she'd planned it that way all along." She paused. "She would have loved this kitchen. She sounds like someone you've been trying to live up to." Abigail was quiet for a moment, something landing in her that she had not seen coming. "Yes," she said. "Suppose she does." They sat in the warm kitchen with the wind outside and the fire between them and the night at its deepest point around them, and something moved in that space that had been moving for weeks, slowly and inevitably, the way the thaw moved under the frozen ground. Invisible from the surface, undeniable in its direction. Nathan set down his cup. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I have spent enough time in this house trying to manage things indirectly, and I don't have the patience for it anymore." She looked at him. "You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch and this family in longer than I care to calculate," he said, "and I am aware that you came here as hired help, and that there are appropriate lines between us, and I am also aware that I stopped being able to locate those lines with any precision about 3 weeks ago." He paused. "I'm not saying this to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because I think you should know what's happening inside this house before it becomes obvious to everyone else, if it hasn't already." Abigail was very still. "It might already be obvious to Margaret," she said carefully. Something shifted in his expression to the beginning of a smile, reluctant and genuine. "It is definitely already obvious to Margaret. And to Lucy, I think. Lucy asked me last week if I thought you were going to stay." He looked at his hands. "She asked it the way she asks questions she already have opinions about." The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind found a new angle on the house and tested it, the way it always did, patient and relentless, looking for the weak point, the place where things might give. This house did not give. Abigail looked at Nathan Holloway, at the lines around his eyes and the gray in his beard and the particular quality of exhaustion in his face that came not from one hard night but from 2 hard years. And she thought about what she had said to Lucy. "Some places feel like they've been waiting for you." She thought about a carpet bag and a letter and a woman at a door who had looked at her like a problem. She thought about what it meant to stop running. "It's a complicated situation," she said. "I know. I work for you." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you for anything, Abigail. I'm just—" He stopped. "I just wanted you to know, in case it mattered." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It matters." He nodded once and stood and picked up his coat from near the stove and pulled it back on with the same careful movements of a body that had been very cold and was not yet fully trusting the warmth. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll check the fire before I go back out." "I'm all right. I know you are." He paused at the kitchen door, looking back at her, and his expression in the firelight was something she thought she might carry with her for a very long time. "You always are. That's one of the things that scares me a little. People who are always all right sometimes forget they're allowed not to be. He went back out into the cold, and she sat alone in the kitchen and let that settle into her. The particular quality of being seen accurately by someone who had been paying careful attention. Then she picked up her mending and kept working, because the night was long and there was always something more to do. And she was who she was, and some things about a person did not change. The cold frame glass cracked on Thursday. The temperature dropped too severe, the thermal shock too much for the old glazing. Abigail was outside before anyone else had assessed the damage, crouched in the brutal cold with a lantern, checking what had survived beneath the broken frame. The time was damaged but not killed. The sage was intact. The most vulnerable seedlings she had been nursing along the south wall were gone, frozen through in the night. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, the cold working through her coat, looking at what remained. Holt Crane appeared beside her with a piece of canvas. "Got this from the barn," he said. "It's not glass, but it'll hold the warmth better than nothing." She looked up at him. "Everett's cutting new pieces from the last of the old window stock," he added. "Should have it replaced by afternoon if we work fast." "You don't need to—" "We know we don't." He unfolded the canvas and began laying it over the frame. "Grab that edge." She grabbed the edge. They worked in the brittle, blue-edged cold of early morning, breath clouding between them, and Ben came out in his coat done up wrong with 3 buttons missed and his hat at an angle and insisted on helping hold things down while Holt pinned the canvas, and Lucy brought out coffee in the good tin cups without being asked, and Tomas arrived with the new glass pieces cut and wrapped in cloth. And Nathan came last and stood for a moment at the edge of the garden watching his ranch hands and his children and his cook working together in the cold over a pair of wooden frames protecting dormant herbs. And his face was the face of a man watching something he had not known he was building until he saw it finished. The frames were repaired by 9 o'clock. The time came back. It always did, Abigail thought, carrying the empty coffee cups back to the kitchen with Lucy beside her and Ben running ahead of them both, slipping once on the ice and catching himself and pretending he had meant to do that. The things with good roots came back. You just had to protect them long enough to let them find their way. Inside, the stove was warm and the bread from the previous night had survived, and the kitchen held the smell of coffee and effort and the particular intimate warmth of a house that had people in it who intended to stay. Abigail set down the cups and looked at the kitchen, her kitchen now, though she had never said that aloud and might never, and felt the thing she had been feeling for weeks settle more firmly into something she recognized as home. Not perfect, not easy, not guaranteed, but home the same way certain things were home. Not because they were flawless, but because they were yours and you had decided to stay, and that decision, made and remade every morning when you got up before light and built the fire, was the thing that made a place real. She rolled up her sleeves. There was breakfast to make. January came in hard and stayed hard, the way Wyoming January always did, without apology and without relief. The temperature climbed above 0 for exactly 4 days in the first 3 weeks of the month, and on those 4 days, everyone at Iron Ridge Ranch worked outside with a focused urgency, repairing what the cold had damaged and preparing for the cold that was certainly coming back. Fences that had been listing since autumn finally got the attention they had needed. The barn's leaning south wall got a proper brace, Holt and Everett working from a plan that Nathan had sketched on the back of an envelope, Tomas hauling lumber while the Crane brothers swore quietly and competently at the structural problems they uncovered once they started opening things up. Abigail took those 4 warmer days to the garden. She moved methodically through the beds, assessing what had made it and what hadn't, clearing the dead material with careful hands and composting it at the edge of the garden in a pile that would feed the soil by spring. The cold frames held. The time had come back fully. The sage was leggy but alive, and she cut it back by 1/3 and mulched the crown heavily and gave it her best estimate of what it needed to make it to March. Ben helped, or tried to. His version of helping in the garden involved a great deal of digging in places that had not been designated for digging, and occasional philosophical questions about why some plants lived through frost and others didn't, and a running commentary on the relative merits of various vegetables that suggested he had thought about this more than most 6-year-olds had occasion to. "Turnips are not as bad as I used to think," he announced on the second afternoon, kneeling in the dirt beside her with his small trowel. "High praise," she said. "I still like apples better." "Most people do." He dug for a moment in companionable silence, then, Abigail, are you going to stay? She kept her hands moving in the soil. What do you mean, after winter? He was looking at the cold frame glass, not at her. Some people come for a while and then go. Mrs. Peters stayed 7 months and then left for Denver. The man who worked in the barn before Tomas stayed 2 years and then left. He paused. Are you going to leave too? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. At his small, serious face turned toward her now, the question in it larger and more vulnerable than his voice had let on. I don't have plans to go anywhere, Ben, she said. That's not the same as staying. He was 6 years old, and he was absolutely right, and she understood in that moment that children who had lost their mother did not have the luxury of being reassured by vague intentions. They needed more than I don't plan to leave. They had already learned that plans changed without warning, that the people you relied on most could be there one morning and gone by spring, through no fault of anyone's, and that the world did not adjust its timing to spare you. She put down her trowel and looked at him squarely. I'm staying, she said. That's my plan, and it's a real one, all right? He studied her face for a long, careful moment with those dark eyes that missed very little. Then he nodded once with the seriousness of someone recording a fact for later verification and went back to his digging. She went back to hers, and the cold January wind moved over the garden, and she thought about what she had just said and understood, without quite having decided it before that moment, that she had meant it completely. The letter from Harmon's store arrived in the second week of January, carried by the mail rider who came out from town every Tuesday when the roads were passable. Nathan brought it to the kitchen where Abigail was working and set it on the counter without opening it, and she looked at it and then at him. From Harmon? She asked. The doctor in Casper. He picked it up again and opened it, and read it standing at the counter, his face giving nothing away, the controlled expression of a man who had learned not to react until he had read all the way to the end. He read it twice. Then he set it down. He wants to enter into a regular supply arrangement, he said. Dried medicinal herbs, consistent monthly supply. He's offering a fixed price per pound, that is... He stopped, looked up. It's a fair price, Abigail, more than fair. She kept her hands on the bread dough she was working. How much does it cover? Against the note? He did the calculation in his head. She watched him do it, the slight movement behind his eyes. 20%, maybe a little more, if the garden produces at the rate you've been projecting. A pause. 20% is significant. 20% plus Margaret's contribution, plus the breeding stock sale that Holt arranged last week, she said. That's more than half. More than half is not the full amount. No. She shaped the dough and covered it and turned to face him. But more than half is not nothing, Nathan. More than half is a conversation with the bank that looks different from the conversation you'd be having without it. Banks prefer working with men who are demonstrably solving their problems to foreclosing on men who have given up solving them. It's more work for the bank to foreclose. He looked at her steadily. You know a great deal about banks for a cook. I know a great deal about surviving with limited resources, she said, which amounts to the same thing, eventually. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to Laramie next week to talk to the bank directly. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. I'd like you to come with me. She blinked. To the bank? I want them to understand what's changed here. Not just the numbers. The numbers are better, but they're not conclusive on their own. I want them to understand the full situation. He met her eyes. You understand the full situation better than I do, in some respects. And you explain things clearly. You want me to talk to your banker? I want you sitting across the table from him so that when I describe what's happening at Iron Ridge, he can look at the person who's making it happen and understand that it's real. He paused. If you're willing. She thought about a bank office in Laramie. She thought about a banker looking at her across a desk the way people sometimes looked at her, adding things up and arriving at conclusions before she had spoken a word. She thought about the quiet determination she had carried through every room where that had happened, in schoolrooms and boarding houses and kitchen doorways across half the country. I'm willing, she said. They went to Laramie on a Wednesday when the road was hard frozen and passable, Nathan driving the wagon with Abigail beside him on the bench, both of them wrapped in every layer the house could provide against the cold. The trip was 3 hours each way, and they talked for most of it. Not about the bank, exactly, but around the edges of everything. The comfortable and occasionally probing conversation of two people who had been learning each other in close quarters for nearly 3 months and had accumulated enough material for several long journeys. She told him about Cincinnati and the 3 years she had spent in Chicago after her mother died, working in a hotel kitchen under a French chef who had been deeply unpleasant but technically brilliant, and how she had learned from him the way you learned from difficult people, by taking what was useful and leaving everything else behind. Nathan told her about Eleanor, the first time he had, unprompted and without the careful management he brought to the subject when the children might hear. He told her how they had met at a church social in Cheyenne when he was 22, and she was 19, and he had been so determined to impress her that he had knocked an entire punch bowl off a table, and how she had laughed, not politely, not the way you laughed at someone else's embarrassment, but genuinely, with her whole face, and he had known in that moment that he was in serious trouble. He told it quietly, with the cadence of someone who had not told that particular story in a long time, and was discovering that it still had warmth in it, that grief was not the only thing that remained when love outlasted its person. "She sounds remarkable," Abigail said. "She was." A pause. She'd have done what you've done. In the same situation, she'd have walked in and rolled up her sleeves and refused to let the place die. He looked at the road ahead. That used to make it harder, thinking about that. But lately it seems more like company, somehow. Does that make sense? "Yes," Abigail said. "That makes a great deal of sense." The banker's name was Mr. Aldous Fitch, a compact, precise man in his 50s who had the cautious eyes of someone whose professional life consisted of calculating the distance between what people said and what they would actually deliver. He received them in a well-heated office and spread the Holloway account across his desk with the practiced neutrality of someone who had had difficult conversations before and preferred to have them efficiently. He looked at the numbers. He looked at Nathan. He looked at Abigail, and she met his eyes without apology or performance, just steadily, the way she looked at anything she was not afraid of. "Miss Harper," he said, "you manage the household at Iron Ridge?" "I manage the kitchen and the domestic economy," she said, "which at a working ranch encompasses more than it might at a town residence." He looked back at the figures Nathan had brought. The herb supply contract, the breeding stock sale receipts, the projected garden income, the careful accounting of what the household had saved through January in provisions and preserved stores. These numbers represent a significant shift from 6 months ago. "They represent 2.5 months of work," Abigail said. "The trajectory is upward, and the fundamentals that are producing it, the garden, the supply relationship with the doctor and Casper, the reorganization of the household economy, those are structural changes, not one-time events. The income they generate will compound through spring and into summer." Fitch looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating. "You have a background in financial management," he asked. "I have a background in making sure that the people I cook for don't run out of money before they run out of winter," she said. "The mathematics are similar." Nathan made a sound beside her that was carefully not a smile. Fitch looked at his papers again, and then at Nathan, and then at the figures in a way that was perceptibly different from how he had looked at them when they first sat down. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When they came out of the bank into the January cold, Nathan stood on the steps for a moment and breathed the icy air in slowly, and Abigail watched him and waited. "He's going to hold the note to March," he said. "But he said—" He stopped. "He said if the February numbers hold the pattern, he's prepared to discuss restructuring the terms, extending the payment timeline." He looked at her. "That's not nothing. That's considerably more than nothing," she said. He laughed. The real kind, unguarded, tipping his head back slightly, and it changed his face the way it always did, the way she had decided she would not get tired of watching. They had dinner at a modest restaurant near the livery, the first time Abigail had sat in a restaurant in longer than she could easily calculate. And the conversation moved away from the bank and the ranch and the note and wandered into territory that had nothing to do with any of it, books they had both read in places neither of them had been, and opinions about things that didn't matter practically, but were interesting to compare. It was easy in a way that surprised her, or would have surprised her if she had been honest about still being surprised by Nathan Holloway, which she was less and less. The drive home was dark, the road lit by a cold half-moon and the particular blue-white brightness of snow under a clear sky. They rode mostly in silence, the comfortable kind, with the horses moving steadily and the ranch growing closer through the dark. And at some point, she didn't quite know when, Nathan's shoulder had shifted against hers on the wagon bench in a way that was not accidental, and she had not moved away. They came back to the ranch at 9 o'clock, and Tomas appeared to take the horses, and light was showing in the kitchen window. And when they went inside, they found Lucy at the stove with the composed authority of someone who had decided to be in charge for the evening and was not interested in commentary about it. And the kitchen smelled of something warm and competent. "Potato soup," Lucy said without turning around. "With thyme from the cold frame. Ben said it smelled right." Abigail looked at the stove, her stove in her kitchen, being managed by a 13-year-old girl who had once been unable to step through this doorway, and felt something enormous and quiet move through her. "It smells exactly right," she said. Lucy turned around, and something in her face did what it did now sometimes, the careful distance briefly failing, the real thing showing through. "How did it go?" she asked. "With the bank? Well," Nathan said, "better than it could have." He hung his coat and hat and looked at his daughter with the particular quality of attention he was capable of when he was not managing anything. "You cooked supper." "Someone had to." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down, both of you. It's ready." Ashcroft came back on the last Saturday of January. Abigail heard the horse from the kitchen and looked out the window and felt something go still and steady in her chest, the particular stillness that preceded the thing you had been preparing for. She dried her hands and went to find Nathan and met him in the hallway, already moving toward the door. "I see him," Nathan said. "Do you need anything from me?" He stopped and looked at her. In the hallway light, with his coat half buttoned and his jaw set and his eyes clear, he looked like a man who had made every decision he needed to make and was simply waiting for the occasion to say so. "No," he said. "I've got this." He opened the door. Ashcroft dismounted with his usual unhurried grace and came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw Nathan's expression. The smile arrived on schedule, but something behind it recalculated. "Nathan," he said, "I hope you'll hear me out. I've sweetened the terms further. I think you'll find it considerably more than generous. Mr. Ashcroft." Nathan's voice was even and final, the voice of a man who was not angry because he did not need to be. "I told you no in December. The answer has not changed. The answer will not change. Iron Ridge Ranch is not for sale, not at your current figure, not at a higher one, not in February when you believe the winter will have made me more desperate." He paused. "I understand you spoke to my bank in Laramie. I spoke to them myself this week. Our conversation went well. I do not believe we need to have this one again." Ashcroft was quiet for a moment. The practiced smoothness held, but beneath it something was doing a different calculation than it was accustomed to making. "You're taking a significant risk," he said. "Yes," Nathan said. "I am. It's my risk to take." Another pause. Ashcroft looked past Nathan into the hallway, and Abigail was standing there, and he looked at her for a moment with the frank appraisal of a man who was now understanding what variable in this situation he had failed to account for. He nodded, slowly, with the grace of a man who knew when the cards had gone against him and intended to leave the table before it became undignified. "Good day, then," he said. "Good day," Nathan said, and closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment, hand still on the door. Then he turned around, and Abigail was there, and he looked at her with the expression she had by now identified as the one that belonged only to moments when he had stopped managing his face and was simply himself inside it. "That's done," he said. "That's done," she agreed. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at them both with an expression that on a less composed woman might have been called relief. "Is he gone?" she asked. "He's gone," Nathan said. A pause. Then Margaret descended the stairs with her usual precision, and at the bottom she did something that Abigail had never seen her do and did not expect. She reached out and briefly, firmly pressed Abigail's hand between both of hers and said nothing, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. Abigail stood in the hallway and looked at the door that Ashcroft had walked away from and understood that some doors, when they closed, opened something else. February passed the way February in Wyoming always did, stubbornly, slowly, in a way that tested the commitment of everyone who had decided to remain. The cold did not relent, but it varied, and in the variation there was the first distant suggestion of what was coming on the other side of it. The light changed, barely perceptibly at first, and then with increasing conviction, the afternoons holding their brightness a few minutes longer every week. The herb garden began visibly responding. Abigail spent 10 minutes with it every morning, checking, adjusting, removing the frames on the warmest days to let the plants breathe and replacing them before evening. The time was lush enough now to harvest lightly. The sage had come back stronger than she had hoped, the cutting she had made in January having spurred rather than set back the new growth. She found, in the third week of February, that the leeks she had left in the south wall bed through the whole brutal winter had not only survived, but were ready to harvest. 3 of them, deep-rooted and determined and green at the center where the cold had not reached. She brought them into the kitchen and set them on the work table and stood there for a moment just looking at them. Lucy came in and stopped. "From the garden?" she said. "From the garden." Lucy picked one up and turned it in her hands, looking at the fresh green of it with an expression that was aware of everything it meant. The winter survived, the garden that had been given up on, the root systems that had held. "Mama planted leeks," she said softly. "I know. Will you teach me how to make the soup? The way she made it?" Abigail looked at her, at this girl who had arrived in her kitchen 8 weeks ago as someone who couldn't step through the doorway, who was now standing at the work table asking to learn. "I don't know your mother's exact recipe," she said, "but we can work it out together. We know the ingredients she used. We can figure out the rest." Lucy nodded and set the leek down with the care of something significant and rolled up her sleeves. They made the soup together that afternoon, Abigail guiding and Lucy driving, working through the proportions by taste and memory and the particular instinct that Lucy had for this work, the instinct that came from a childhood spent watching her mother do it and had been waiting, underground like the leek roots, for the conditions that would let it grow. When Nathan came in at 4 o'clock and smelled what was on the stove, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and his face went through several things in quick succession. "Is that—" He stopped. "Potato and leek," Lucy said, stirring with focused attention. "I made it. Abigail helped." Nathan looked at his daughter at the stove. He looked at Abigail. She looked back at him and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Because some moments were complete exactly as they were, and commentary would only reduce them. He sat down at the kitchen table without a word and stayed there while supper finished, watching his daughter cook in her mother's kitchen, and whatever was happening in his face, he did not try to manage. The bank letter came on the 2nd of March, 4 days before the note deadline, and Nathan read it at the kitchen table in the morning with Abigail across from him and the household still mostly asleep around them. He set it down. "They've agreed to restructure," he said. 18-month extension on the remaining balance. Adjusted interest rate. He was quiet for a moment. "We need to stay current on the monthly payments, which are manageable with the herb income and what we'll bring from the spring cattle." He looked up. "We're not clear, but the ranch is going to make it to spring, Abigail." She let the breath out slowly. "The ranch is going to make it past spring," she said. "Do it right, and it makes it to summer. Do summer right, and you're talking about next year. And next year the herd is bigger, and the garden is established, and Harmon's arrangement is running properly, and—" She stopped herself. "One thing at a time." He looked at her across the table in the early morning kitchen light, and she looked at him, and the word that lived in the space between them had been living there for a while now, growing in the same quiet way that the time had grown. Steadily, without announcement, becoming real before anyone had formally decided it was going to. "Abigail," he said. "Nathan. I have been thinking about how to say something for about 6 weeks. I know." She kept her hands around her coffee cup. "I've been watching you think about it." He almost smiled. And I think you should say it," she said, "because I think we've both been patient enough, and the winter is almost over, and some things shouldn't wait for better circumstances that may or may not arrive." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear the house beginning to wake, Ben's feet hitting the floor above them, the particular thump and shuffle of a 6-year-old locating his boots, Lucy's door opening softly, Tomas already moving in the yard outside. "I would like you to stay at Iron Ridge," Nathan said, "not as the cook, or not only as the cook, as someone who is building this place alongside me, as a partner in it, as—" He stopped, looking for the word, and then settled on the direct one because it was the one he meant. I would like you to consider making this your home, permanently. And I am aware that is a significant thing to ask, and I am aware that I haven't. Yes, Abigail said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, simply, without drama, the way she said things she was certain of. That's my answer, Nathan. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, the controlled face finally entirely failing, the real thing showing through without any management at all. Something open and relieved and warm and frightened and convinced all at once. The face of a man who had decided to trust something again and found that the ground held. Ben arrived in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his boots already on, which told a story about the sequence of events upstairs. What are we having for breakfast? He demanded. Oats, Abigail said. He made a face that lasted about 2 seconds before he remembered the dried apples and revised it. He climbed onto his stool and looked between his father and Abigail with the acute perceptive quality of a child who had noticed something but hadn't yet determined whether to comment on it. Papa looks happy, he said as a factual observation. Your father is having a good morning, Abigail said, turning to the stove. Are you staying? Ben asked. Not with the vulnerability he'd had in the garden in January, but with the confidence of someone checking a fact they were fairly certain of. I'm staying, she said. He nodded, satisfied, and asked for extra apples in his oats. Lucy appeared a few minutes later and looked at her father, and then at Abigail, and then back at her father. And the small, careful smile that crossed her face was the smile of someone whose instincts had been confirmed. The private satisfaction of a 13-year-old girl who had asked her father a question 3 months ago about whether he thought the cook was going to stay, and had known what the honest answer was even then. She came to the counter and stood beside Abigail and asked if she could do the bread this morning, and Abigail showed her the measurements and stepped back and let her. Margaret came down last, as always, and took her place at the table with her coffee and looked at the room, at Ben on his stool, at Lucy working the bread dough with new confidence, at Nathan with the ledger open but his eyes on his daughter, at Abigail at the stove managing breakfast with the same efficient grace she brought to everything. And something moved in Margaret Voss's careful face, something that resolved itself, after a moment, into the expression of a woman who had been proved wrong in the best possible way and was choosing, quietly, to be glad of it. The bread smells good, Lucy, she said. Lucy looked up, surprised by the directness of it. I'm still learning. You're doing well. Margaret picked up her coffee cup. Your mother would say the same. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of Eleanor Holloway, who had put up plums and planted leeks and loved a kitchen that was now warm again and in good hands. It was full of everything that had happened in these walls since a worn carpetbag had been set on the kitchen floor in November, full of the accumulated weight of small decisions and daily work and meals made carefully and fires kept burning through the coldest nights. Abigail set breakfast on the table and sat down with them, fully, properly, not at the edge of the room, but at the table, where she had been sitting for weeks but which meant something different this morning, which meant what she understood it to mean now. And they ate together in the warmth of a kitchen that had once gone cold and quiet and had been steadily, stubbornly, tenderly called back to life. Outside, the March wind still moved across the land and tested the fences that had been repaired and found them holding. The cold frame stood in the corner of the garden that was no longer dead, and beneath the glass the thyme was green and the sage was thick, and along the south wall the ground was beginning, just beginning, to soften. The barn stood straight-walled and braced. The cattle in the north pasture were watered and tended. The chimney sent its smoke into a sky that was, for the first time in months, showing the particular shade of pale blue that belonged to the edge of winter, the moment just before the season conceded. Iron Ridge Ranch stood, not because the hardship had ended, it hadn't entirely, and it wouldn't be honest to say so. The work ahead was real, and the road was long, and there would be other cold nights and other problems that presented themselves without warning, because that was the nature of land and of living, and no one who worked close to both could pretend otherwise. But the people inside those walls had made their decisions. Tomas, who had stayed when others left and would keep staying, because this was where he had chosen to put his loyalty and his years. Holt and Everett Crane, who had repaired fences and built cold frames and broken ice in the dark, because somewhere in the past 3 months, this ranch had become the kind of place worth doing those things for. Margaret Voss, who had loved her sister's family through grief and fear and one significant mistake, and who was learning, slowly, in her precise and careful way, that admitting you were wrong about someone was not a defeat but a different kind of strength. Lucy Holloway, who had learned to walk back into her mother's kitchen and stand at the stove and feed the people she loved with her own hands, carrying the past forward instead of carrying it as weight. Ben Holloway, who had set a table on his first day and asked for dried apples and told the truth about honey tasting like it came from somewhere, and who had known from the beginning, with the unerring clarity of a child who paid attention, that the woman who had arrived with the worn carpetbag was going to stay. Nathan Holloway, who had hired a cook sight unseen and found something he had not known he was still capable of finding, and who would spend the rest of a long life being grateful for the particular rut in the road that had rattled Cobb's wagon to a stop on a gray November afternoon. And Abigail Harper, 26 years old, who had arrived carrying grief and a carpetbag and the quiet, undefeated determination of a woman who had never stopped knowing what she was worth, no matter how many rooms had tried to tell her differently. She had come here running from the past. She had stayed because she had finally found something worth running toward. The bread was rising on the counter. The oats were warm in the bowls. The leeks in the south wall bed were green at their hearts, as they had been all winter, waiting for the sun to come back around. It always did.